Mobile County Sheriff's Office.
I believe I've seen a dead person. Their face looks all beat up.
I just couldn't understand why somebody would do that.
There's someone going out and killing people. We don't know what the circumstances are.
We were able to review surveillance videos that show this white SUV heading towards our crime scene.
We needed to interview these 3 people and see where they were on the night of the murder.
Let me tell you this, okay?
I've got you on video. We've got you on video.
Uncle Johnny, he had come by our house.
I have gifts for my birthday, girls. Oh, good to see you.
And he had brought some birthday gifts for our daughter and for my wife, who have a birthday within 7 days of each other. Uncle Johnny was a very fun guy to be around. He was very welcoming, very warm, and very kind.
Here you go.
We lived about an hour and 30 minutes from my mother's house in Mobile, Alabama, where my Uncle Johnny, my mother, and my grandmother lived. My Uncle Johnny started working as a flight attendant when he lived in Venezuela. He loved to travel around the world, and he got to meet a lot of people. After my Uncle Johnny stopped being a flight attendant, he moved to the United States and started working in the aerospace company as an interior mechanic. He was very social. He was going on dates, but he didn't have a long-time partner at the time.
Finally found Mr. Right?
No, but hope springs eternal.
Johnny was looking for Mr. Right, if you will.
Maybe one day. Yeah.
He had so much to offer, and I think he wanted to share that with someone.
You have a great birthday. Oh, great. Take care. Good to see you. Charlie, gotta go. Don't play later. All right? Say bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Say bye.
Bye-bye.
Dile bye a tío. Mobile County Sheriff's Office.
There's a cul-de-sac off of Boiler Road. I believe I've seen a dead person laying there.
Okay.
Their face looks all beat up, and they're laying there on their back. I'm pretty sure it's a human. I didn't get out to look. It was freaking me out a little bit.
All right. We'll get a deputy to meet you there, okay?
Thank you, ma'am.
It took 20 to 30 minutes to get to the scene. I was the commander over Criminal Investigations Division. It was in a remote area, so it was clearly a dump job. It was in a dead end of what was going to be a residential area that never really got developed. So there were no cameras or anything in the immediate scene.
Patrol officers secure the location before the investigators arrive.
What do we have here?
Detective Gazier was the lead investigator assigned to this case.
EMS arrived with patrol officers, and they checked the vitals of the victim, and he was pronounced deceased on the scene.
There was lividity and rigor mortis setting in, so we knew that he had been expired for at least a few hours.
The trauma appeared to be a gunshot wound above his right eye.
There was apparent blunt force trauma to his face with teeth missing. His pants pockets had been turned inside out. There was loose change on the ground.
Looking around further, we found the tooth and a toothbridge. We looked for a cell phone and a wallet and could not find one.
There was a debit card lying near the body, which allowed us to quickly identify the victim.
Johnny Sokies. Run it. See what comes up.
We were able to take the name off of the ATM debit card, Mr. Johnny Sokies, and put it into our system. Was able to pull his driver's license picture up and identify him.
Contact the bank, get the bank transaction records.
Our next move was to make contact with Mr. Sokies' family. Johnny's address was about 6 miles away from the crime scene.
Aló.
My grandmother called me
Abuela, ¿qué pasó?
very frantically that morning. The cops knocked on her door, and my grandmother doesn't speak any English, so she gave the investigator the phone.
How can I help?
They told me that my uncle had been murdered.
I'll be right there.
When I arrived at the house, the investigators were there, as well as my husband. And then my mother got home.
Mami, siéntate. Mataron a Johnny.
No. Fue muy difícil, muy doloroso. Johnny era mi hermano. Nos abrazamos y lloramos y no sabíamos qué había pasado.
There's a language barrier with Inui, so Donnie was our translator.
Can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Johnny?
¿Hay alguien que le quiere hacer daño?
No.
Johnny had no enemies. I don't know of anyone that Johnny disagreed with.
Was he in a relationship?
I immediately told them about the dating app and the social media accounts.
Johnny was using the apps to look for relationships and love.
Do you know when he left?
¿Sabe a qué hora se fue?
Inui stated she went to bed around 10 p.m. and Johnny was still watching television. Around 7 a.m., when she woke up, she found Johnny's bedroom door open and the front door unlocked. We asked Inui if Johnny had left in his vehicle, and she said no, that the car was still there. She stated that Johnny had to have left with a friend or someone he knew.
A search of his room and the residence revealed that there was no wallet or cell phone of Mr. Sokies found at his house.
Thank you very much for your help. Gazir.
Meantime, investigators receive a list of Johnny's bank transactions.
Okay.
We made contact with Wells Fargo, and they provided us with Johnny's last transaction, which was a withdrawal from an ATM about 10 minutes away from Johnny's house. That was made at 3:25 a.m. on the morning Johnny was killed. We also found out that the ATM had surveillance, and they advised they would be sending us those surveillance shots the next morning.
Investigators search Johnny's neighborhood for home security cameras that might reveal when he left home to go to the ATM.
We observed some cameras on a house about 3 houses east of Johnny's residence. We made contact with that resident.
Hey, I'm Deputy Gazir. Can we take a look at the footage from that camera?
We knew Johnny was at the ATM at 3:25, so we started looking at their surveillance footage starting at 3 a.m. She tells us that it's motion activated and that it only picks up when motion such as a vehicle or someone walks by in front of the residence.
play that part again?
At 3:15, we observed a white mid-sized SUV traveling towards Johnny Soki's house.
Who's behind the wheel?
It didn't show the SUV physically at Mr. Soki's house, but at that particular time, at 3:15 in the morning, most people are asleep. This was the only vehicle in the area.
How's it there?
The camera captures the partial roadway.
Zoom in there.
We attempted to zoom in to get a description of the driver and the license plate, but it was just too distorted.
We're not able to make out a specific make and model.
We can just get the color of the vehicle and that it was a white SUV.
Play it.
This residence with the surveillance is 3 houses down and just on the opposite side of the street. So we believe as it gets off of the camera angle, it stops at Johnny's residence, picks him up, and then they leave that location.
We knew that he had gotten a ride from someone because we think these minutes later at the ATM, and this clearly validates that he did leave with another person.
Thanks, Brian.
Investigators review the information from local traffic cameras to try to identify the SUV.
So we gathered data from a tag reader that we have located at Children's Airport near the ATM. The tag reader had picked up a vehicle matching the description from the surveillance camera. This time of morning, that was the only vehicle that passed through the intersection.
We ran the vehicle's license plate to figure out who the registered owner was.
Located that vehicle at an apartment complex, followed that vehicle from the apartment complex to the airport, and then made an investigative stop. I was notified, and then I responded out. There was just one occupant in the vehicle, which was the driver. So I interviewed that individual on the scene at the airport. The driver was identified, and he worked for Allied Taxi Service. I'd asked him if he had picked Johnny up, and he said no. He stated he'd picked up a couple of fares in the area. I asked him what time. He said he picked up a fare from a hotel and then was at the airport at around 3:25.
I went to the airport to gather surveillance footage.
Let's start from 3:25. There it is. Zoom in there.
The footage showed the taxi driver at the airport at 3:25 dropping fares off.
And we knew that at 3:25, Johnny Soki's and another white SUV were at the Wells Fargo bank withdrawing money. So the taxi driver was telling the truth about what he had done and where he had been. His story was corroborated with video evidence, and he was no longer a person of interest after that.
Okay, thanks.
The next morning, Johnny's family are still coming to terms with what's happened.
No tengo idea por qué un ser humano le quita la vida a otro ser humano, más mi hermano Johnny.
It was very sad and quiet. He was always the loud one, and not having him there and knowing what happened was really hard for all of us.
Seeing his bedroom off the corner of the living room. Knowing that he's never going to walk through the door again was the hardest part.
So on October 26th, the day after Johnny Soke's murder, I received the footage from Wells Fargo of Mr. Soke's transaction.
I got images from the bank.
So we're expecting, a full motion video, but this was just still shots of the transaction.
Show me the first one. That's Johnny.
We see Johnny standing at the ATM holding his phone and his wallet. He's wearing a red shirt, the same red shirt that we found him in at the crime scene.
Show me the next image. Zoom in on the background.
And then we also see this white SUV in the background that matched the description of the surveillance that we had captured from Johnny's neighborhood. This is big. At this point, we knew Johnny had his wallet and his phone on him. And then this also confirms the vehicle that we observed in Johnny's neighborhood as being the vehicle that picked him up.
I think I recognize the model.
We was able to key in on a feature on that vehicle. There was a light that was located underneath the side view mirror. So it appeared to be a Lincoln Aviator.
Go to the next one. Who's that?
We can see Johnny Soke's in the video with an unknown black male standing behind him and the white SUV in the background behind that male.
This didn't seem right. This individual standing behind Johnny.
Can you clean it up? This is the best I can get.
We knew that we needed to find out who this individual was.
We want to track where this vehicle came from to look for other video where we could get a visual of the driver of the vehicle.
So at this point, we've established Johnny was picked up at his residence. He had made the withdrawal at the ATM, and then we established the crime scene where Johnny's body was located.
We were able to pull up an aerial map of the subdivision. There's only 2 points of entrance and exit to this neighborhood, and that helped you determine where to canvass for surveillance video.
Deputies searched for security cameras along the route between Johnny's house, the ATM, and the crime scene.
We were able to retrieve surveillance videos from multiple businesses with several different cameras.
Play it.
Palmer's Airport Toyota has a surveillance camera that captures the ATM across the street.
Play that part again. Zoom in there. There goes the Lincoln.
At 324, I see the white Lincoln Aviator pull up across the street at the Wells Fargo ATM. And we can see Johnny walk to the ATM. He goes back to the car.
Once he leaves the ATM, we need to see which route he took to get to Linda Court.
Bring up the next camera.
We're able to almost live time see the progression of where this vehicle goes.
At 3:27 a.m., the Food Mart on Dawes Road captures the white Lincoln Aviator traveling southwest, which is about a mile from the ATM.
Pause it there and punch in on the plate.
we were unable to get a tag number off of the white Lincoln Aviator.
What else we got?
At 3:31, we observed the white Lincoln Aviator pass in front of Pete's Place, which is about 1.5 miles from Dahl's Food Mart. The vehicle was traveling southwest toward Linda's Court, where Johnny's body was found. So at this point, we have a clear direction of travel, and we believe Johnny's in the vehicle, who is being driven by a male with a blue shirt who could be Johnny's killer.
Investigators received the report from Johnny's autopsy.
Thanks.
The autopsy report said that Johnny suffered a gunshot wound above his right eye, and there was a .44 Magnum projectile retrieved from his jaw. He was also beaten so badly, his dental bridge broke.
Next day, investigators received the report on the GPS data from Johnny's cell.
Give me those locations.
Johnny's first cell phone ping was at 3:21, which tied into the neighbor's surveillance video across the street of him leaving his neighborhood. The phone continued to ping toward the ATM and then along the route that the white SUV took to the crime scene.
At 3:38 a.m., Johnny's phone pings at Linda Court, where the 911 caller finds his body 8 hours later. But this is not the last ping.
At 4:20 a.m., there's one final ping.
Johnny Soki's phone was powered off at 4:20 around Carroll Plantation and Old Pascagoula Road, which is about 10 to 15 miles from Linda Court, where Johnny Soki's body was discovered.
We believe that this is where the suspect could have went after the crime.
Thanks. Big, I gotta leave. Let's go.
Investigators zero in on the precise location of the final phone ping.
On October 29th, I was in the area of Old Pascagoula and Carroll Plantation Road attempting to locate Johnny Soki's cell phone when I observed a white Lincoln Aviator parked outside some apartments and was able to observe a tag number on the vehicle. I watched a black male and a white female enter the white Lincoln Aviator. At which point they exit the apartment complex and travel west on Old Pascagoula Road. I stayed at the apartment. Other investigators were able to catch up with the vehicle on Old Pascagoula Road.
It pulls into a local convenience store.
81 clear. Hit 14 clear.
The female gets out. The driver remains in the car, drives away from the business, gets back on Old Pascagoula Road.
Investigators run the Aviator's license plate. The vehicle is registered to a Kenzie Fisher. She is the passenger inside the vehicle that detectives are surveilling.
We were able to find a relationship to that passenger of a black male with the name of Sobrante Rhodes. And we was able to identify the driver being Sobrante Rhodes. With that information, we were also able to ascertain that he had some active warrants on him.
So as I'm observing the apartment complex, the white Lincoln Aviator returns. Minutes later, a car pulls up next to the Lincoln Aviator.
White male gets out of the car, goes over to the vehicle, gets into the passenger side of the Aviator.
The white Lincoln Aviator drives out of the apartment block. They're then observed traveling just down the street to a business complex where they park in front of a business.
So we conducted a traffic stop on that vehicle. We removed Sobrante from the driver's side, and we removed the white male from the passenger side. We detained the two. From that point, we seal the vehicle, and we have it towed and impounded. We sent another unit to the convenience store, and they detained the female passenger that was dropped off. We needed to interview these 3 people to find out their whereabouts on the night of the murder.
We interviewed the passenger of the white Lincoln Aviator, Connor Moretti.
We asked Connor Moretti who Sobrante Rhodes was to him and how we knew him.
That's the first time I met him. I don't even know his name.
Did you message him or he messaged you?
I messaged him this morning, and then we arranged hookup. Yeah.
Yep.
That's it.
Okay.
He expressed interest. We traded pictures.
It's interesting to see this guy had met Sobrante Rhodes on a dating app, just like Johnny Sokeys did. We asked Connor Moretti if he knew Johnny Sokeys.
Does that guy look familiar to you at all?
He messaged me one time, but I didn't respond.
He's from Venezuela?
I don't know his name. I just know
Would it still be in your phone?
No, because
How do you know he messaged you?
I remember that face. That's just one of those faces you'll recognize.
You never messaged him back?
Nothing tight.
After a search of Connor Moretti's cell phone, we observed there was no communication between him and Johnny Sokeys on the night of the murder.
This gentleman had no involvement in the murder of Johnny Sokeys.
So we was able to mark him off the suspect list.
Next, investigators interview Sobrante's girlfriend, Kenzie Fisher.
We asked her where she was on the night of October 24th. She said she was home at her apartment.
What time do you go to sleep that night?
9:30.
Okay.
Now, I have trouble sleeping. If he's not in the bed with me, I usually wake up.
She woken up around 2 a.m. and realized Sobrante was gone.
You get up at 2:02 Friday morning. So you got up, okay, you look around, truck's gone.
And she texted him at the time to see where he was.
He says, on my way. It's at 2:21.
Some time lapsed, and he was still out. At 3:53 a.m., she texted Sobrante again.
So when you sent this message at 3:53, he's not home yet.
I asked her if she suspected him of messing around outside their relationship.
I do.
What's your suspicions on that?
Having a different female
Why do you think that?
because he disappears in the middle of the night.
I asked her if Sobrante was seeing men outside of their relationship.
I've never.
Never suspected him of being like that. Never given you any inclinations that he would be sexually attracted to another male.
Okay. She was quite surprised. So I showed her the surveillance footage from the ATM.
Just tell us if you recognize the person in that picture, what his name is.
It looks like Sobrante, but I can't make it out.
Yeah. See the vehicle?
Yeah, I do see the vehicle, and that does look like my vehicle.
I felt that she was upfront about her story and where she was that night. She showed us the messages that she was sending Sobrante that night, asking his whereabouts, so that confirmed her alibi. And her messages also confirmed that Sobrante Rhodes was not home on the night of the murder.
Investigators release Sobrante's girlfriend without charge.
Later that day, I interviewed Sobrante Rhodes.
Unrelated to your warrants, we want to talk to you about another case we've been investigating. Or you wouldn't talk to us?
Yeah, I want on a case.
Okay.
We confronted Sobrante about these dating apps. At first, he was standoffish.
Are you bisexual?
Honestly, I'm not bisexual. I have did. Yes, I'm bisexual.
So I asked Sobrante Rhodes if he met someone by the name of Johnny on the dating app.
I met him on the chat site.
John who?
I don't know his last name. Hispanic dude.
Sobrante told us that he had picked Johnny up from his house.
Where'd you meet him at?
I met him at his house.
Okay. Did you take him anywhere?
I took him to the ATM machine.
What ATM did I go to?
On Shilling, Fargo.
Wells Fargo?
I took him right back home. I wasn't gone away from my girl no time.
So I asked Sobrante the route that they had taken.
When I went home, I went back up airport and I walked the way up Shilling.
All the way down Shilling. You ain't got nowhere else?
Nowhere else.
You should have been back home around 3:30, you saying?
Yeah.
We knew that Sobrante was not telling the truth because we had got video surveillance from Johnny's neighbor that shows Sobrante picking Johnny up but never bringing Johnny back home. So we confronted him with that.
Let me tell you this, okay? We've got you on video going to get Johnny. Got you on video at the ATM with Johnny. Got you on the video leaving the ATM with Johnny. Y'all didn't go directly back home. Y'all went down Dawes Road.
No.
I've got you on video. We've got you on video.
I ain't killed nobody, man. I swear to God.
Did Johnny kill him? Let me ask you, did Johnny kill himself?
I did not kill nobody, man. I did not take that man nowhere. Oh, God, no, I want a lawyer, man.
So Sobrante Rhodes, at that point, asked for a lawyer, and then we ceased the interview.
So at this point, the interview has stopped. The investigators have enough, at which point our office did approve a murder charge for Sobrante Rhodes.
Investigators inform the family of their progress.
Hi.
The investigators called me and told me that they found a suspect, the suspect that was driving the car that night.
What's his name?
I had never heard of Sobrante before.
Mi hija Donnie me dijo que había un sospechoso. Tuve fe en ellos que iban a resolver la situación.
I feel like it was relief for Donnie and her mom and grandmother.
It was a sigh of relief to know that this individual was off the streets, but there's still a lot of work to do. We knew Johnny died from a single gunshot wound to the head from the .44 Magnum.
Ideally, you'd have the murder weapon, you'd have anything that caused the death. We didn't have a murder weapon in this case.
Finding this weapon was going to be crucial to closing this case.
Sobrante Rhodes is now in jail, and he's communicating via email with his girlfriend. He starts talking about the gun that was used in Johnny's murder and saying that it is in the possession of someone else. I swear I didn't kill this man. When I left him, he was alive. I bet if they run the gun from that 20-year-old kid that did the shooting at Exxon Mobil in Theodore gas station the other day, it'd be a match. I don't run with this kid, but I seriously think he killed the man I'm charged with killing. I need to see someone. They got me so wrong. Sobrante Rhodes is saying that someone else was involved in this and that he did not do it.
Investigators review the case file for the shooting that Sobrante describes in his email. They discover that Mobile Police Department arrested 20-year-old Cameron Sullivan for an armed assault at an Exxon gas station 8 days after the murder of Johnny Sokes.
I contacted the case agent working the case, and he gave me the details and told me that they collected a .44 Magnum from that shooting.
The gun was then sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences and tested against the bullet that was recovered from Johnny Sokes. It turned out that it was a match, and that was the gun that was used to kill Johnny Sokes.
Is Sobrante the person that killed Johnny? Or could Cameron Sullivan be Johnny's killer? We interviewed Cameron Sullivan. We asked him about the .44 Magnum.
Cameron Sullivan tells detectives that he purchased the gun recovered from the gas station shooting for $100 on October 26th, the day after Johnny's murder.
He then indicated that he had purchased the gun from Sobrante Rhodes.
Cameron Sullivan told us that he was an associate to Sobrante. We was able to ascertain a phone communication between Cameron Sullivan and Sobrante the day after Johnny Soki's murder.
Have you run his phone GPS?
The cell phone analysis of Cameron Sullivan's phone showed that he was out of state on the morning of the murder.
Thanks.
And so we knew he was not the one that killed Johnny Soki's.
Cameron Sullivan is uninvolved in Johnny's murder. Investigators charge him with no crimes in relation to the killing.
Sobrante Rhodes is trying to evade responsibility for Johnny's death. He clearly knows what happened. He's talking about the gun that was used in the murder. But now he's trying to put the gun and the shooting of Johnny on someone else.
Sobrante Rhodes' murder trial begins on May 15th, 2023. He pleads not guilty. Prosecutor Lauren Walsh sets out the chain of events that led to Johnny's murder.
I think Sobrante Rhodes was living a double, if not a triple life. He had a girlfriend who did not know where he was a lot of the time. He was with all kinds of other people she didn't know about. We know that Johnny and Sobrante were meeting up in the early morning hours of October 25th of 2019. We know that they went to the Wells Fargo ATM together, where they were seen on surveillance, and where we know Johnny Soki withdrew cash. Sobrante Rhodes did not take Johnny home after that.
I believe that he robbed him. I believe that he stole from him. And executed him. Sobrante killed Johnny Soki's for no reason at all.
We believe Sobrante Rhodes chose Linda Court to dump Johnny's body because it was quiet and secluded with no witnesses.
We know his pockets were empty. We know his phone and his wallet were taken. We know that Johnny Soki's phone, it ultimately last connected where Sobrante Rhodes lived.
Johnny's cell phone and wallet was never recovered. We believe when we detained Sobrante and Canamarate that day, Canamarate could very well have been his next victim.
On May 17th, 2023, the jury finds Sobrante Rhodes guilty of intentional murder. The judge sentences him to life without parole.
When we got the verdict, I felt immense gratification and relief that we were able to secure that conviction and get justice, as well as ensure safety for our community so that the public never has to worry about Sobrante Rhodes offending like that again.
He's a very violent person, and he's right where he belongs.
The surveillance footage was immensely important in investigating this case and ultimately securing the conviction of Sobrante Rhodes. It led us to understand where Johnny Soki was, what vehicle he was in, and ultimately who he was with.
I can't understand why this happened to him.
No verlo en la casa, mirar alrededor y no ver sus risas, sus abrazos, sus besos. Todos los días de mi vida lo extraño.
Shortly after this tragedy, there was actually some good news. My wife and I found out we were pregnant too. But we weren't ever able to share that with Johnny.
He was a great person and he did not deserve that at all. And we miss him very much.
Next time on See No Evil.
Kansas City 911.
Someone got stuck. Can you come, please?
This is a personal thing.
I shot him twice and then said, remember me, bitch.
If they go inside, we will have them at that point.
This is like the biggest nightmare I've ever had in my life.
For 30 years, the question haunted Fort Wayne, Indiana. Who took 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley, who killed her, and how could a child disappear so close to home without the person responsible ever being identified? On April 1st, 1988, April was walking toward a friend's house in Fort Wayne when she vanished. She was only 8 years old. The distance was short. The afternoon should have been ordinary. Instead, it became the beginning of one of Indiana's most disturbing cold cases. April never reached her destination. 3 days later, on April 4th, investigators were called to a rural ditch along County Road 68 in southeastern DeKalb County near Spencerville. There, they discovered the body of a young girl. A shoe believed to belong to April was found roughly 1,000 feet from the body. The clothing matched the description of the missing child, and her parents, Janet and Michael Tinsley, were brought to identify her. The autopsy established that April had been sexually assaulted and had died from asphyxiation. Her death was ruled a homicide. The investigation immediately became a desperate search for whoever had taken her. Detectives examined the scene. Witnesses were questioned. The surrounding area was searched. But there was one thing investigators did not yet understand. The killer had left behind something that would survive for decades. Forensic examination of April's underwear produced a DNA profile belonging to an unknown male. In 1988, however, DNA technology was nowhere near what it would become decades later. Investigators could preserve the evidence, but they could not simply enter the unknown profile into a magical database and receive a name. There was no modern genetic genealogy system waiting to trace the killer through distant relatives. There was no nationwide forensic network capable of immediately connecting every biological sample. The profile existed, but the identity behind it remained hidden. And while investigators searched for answers, the community struggled with a terrible reality. A child had been murdered, the offender was still unidentified, and the person responsible could be living somewhere nearby. Then the case took an even darker turn. On May 21, 1990, authorities were called to a barn near Schwartz Road and State Road 37. Written on the barn was a message claiming responsibility for April's murder. The message was crude, taunting, and terrifying. It referred directly to April and even mentioned her missing shoe. The discovery transformed the case. Now investigators were not only searching for a murderer, they were dealing with someone apparently willing to announce his crime to the public. The message suggested confidence. It suggested that whoever wrote it believed he had escaped detection. And most disturbing of all, it suggested that the killer wanted people to know he was still somewhere out there. Years passed. The case remained unsolved. April's name stayed in police files and in the memories of people who had watched the investigation unfold. Her family waited for answers that never came. Then, in 2004, another extraordinary development occurred. Authorities began receiving disturbing reports involving young girls in the Fort Wayne area. Messages were discovered alongside used condoms and other material. Some of the messages claimed that the writer was the person who had kidnapped, raped, and killed April. Investigators collected the evidence. They tested the biological material. And then came a discovery that changed the investigation. The DNA associated with the condoms was consistent with the DNA recovered from April's underwear. The old murder and the new messages were connected by the same genetic profile. The killer had apparently returned to the case, not through a face or a fingerprint, but through DNA. Yet even that breakthrough did not immediately produce a name. The profile told investigators that the same male was connected to the evidence, but it still did not tell them who he was. The case remained frozen between certainty and identity. They knew they were looking for the same person. They knew the biological evidence was real, but the man himself remained beyond reach. For years, the evidence sat inside the investigation like a locked door with no key. The technology needed to open it simply did not exist yet. Then the world of criminal investigation began changing. DNA databases were becoming more sophisticated. Genetic genealogy was emerging as a revolutionary investigative technique. Instead of searching only for the offender himself, investigators could search for relatives who had voluntarily placed their genetic information into genealogy databases. Those relatives could lead researchers into family trees. Family trees could lead to names. Names could lead to suspects. And eventually, a suspect could be tested directly. The method had already attracted enormous attention through other cold cases, but the April Tinsley investigation would become one of the earliest dramatic examples of how this approach could transform a decades-old murder. In the spring of 2018, Fort Wayne detective Brian Martin arranged for advanced genetic testing and analysis of the evidence. Parabon Nanolabs was brought into the investigation. The goal was not simply to confirm what investigators already knew. They needed to turn the anonymous DNA profile into a human identity. The process was painstaking. Genetic genealogists Cease Moore examined the available data and used public genealogy information to trace biological relationships. Instead of looking for one mysterious man directly, the investigators began looking at his family. Slowly, the invisible branches of a family tree began to emerge from the DNA. Then came the moment that investigators had waited 30 years to see. The genetic genealogy work narrowed the possibilities to two surviving brothers in the Fort Wayne area, John Miller and another brother identified in the investigative documents by initials. Suddenly, the cold case had names. For 3 decades, April's killer had existed only as an unknown male profile, a shadow attached to a terrible crime. Now, investigators had 2 possible identities. But genealogy alone was not enough. The investigators still had to determine which brother, if either, was the source of the DNA. That meant returning to traditional police work. Surveillance began. Detectives watched the brothers. They studied their movements. They examined where they lived. They gathered information about their residences and daily lives. One of the brothers quickly became especially important. John Miller. He lived alone in a trailer in Grabille, Indiana, only a short distance from where April's body had been discovered. The proximity did not prove anything. Location alone could never establish guilt, but investigators now had a genetic lead and a specific person to test. They needed confirmation, and that confirmation would come from a place most people would never imagine could become the key to a 30-year-old murder investigation. A household trash bin. In July 2018, investigators covertly collected discarded items from outside Miller's residence. Among the material they recovered were used condoms. The objects were not important because of what they were. They were important because of what they could contain. DNA investigators submitted the material for testing. The comparison would determine whether the man living quietly in that trailer was the same man whose biological evidence had remained connected to April Tinsley's murder for 3 decades. On July 9th, the investigators received the result. The DNA from Miller's discarded material matched the profile associated with the April Tinsley investigation. The 30-year-old mystery had suddenly narrowed to one man. But there was still one final step. Detectives needed to confront him. On July 15, 2018, police went to Miller's residence. They asked him to come with them to the Fort Wayne Police Department. He agreed. Inside the station, investigators advised him of his rights. Then they asked a simple question. Did he know why they wanted to speak with him? According to the probable cause affidavit, Miller immediately responded with 2 words that would become one of the most chilling moments in the entire investigation. April Tinsley. 30 years had passed since April disappeared. 30 years since her body was found in that rural ditch. 30 years since an unknown male DNA profile entered the case file. 30 years since the barn message appeared. 30 years since the community began wondering whether the killer would ever be found. And now, sitting across from investigators, the man they had traced through genetic genealogy appeared to know exactly why they had come. The mystery that had survived for 3 decades had finally produced a name. John D. Miller was arrested and charged in connection with April's murder. According to investigators, he later admitted abducting April, sexually assaulting her, and choking her to death. For April's family, the arrest was the answer they had waited 30 years to receive. For investigators, it was proof that evidence does not necessarily disappear simply because time passes. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes the science catches up. Sometimes a forgotten sample becomes the key to a case everyone once believed might never be solved. And in Fort Wayne, the name April Tinsley could finally be separated from the word unknown. Her killer had not remained a ghost forever. He had left DNA behind. The DNA survived, and 30 years later, it finally led investigators to his door. The arrest of John D. Miller in July 2018 did not erase 30 years of uncertainty overnight, because an arrest was only the beginning of the final chapter, and investigators still had to reconstruct what had happened to April Tinsley, establish the evidence connecting Miller to the crime, and determine how a man who had apparently carried the secret of a child's murder for 3 decades had managed to remain unidentified for so long. And as detectives began putting the pieces together, the story became even more disturbing because the investigation was no longer built around an anonymous DNA profile. It was built around a specific man whose name had emerged through one of the most powerful developments in modern forensic investigation, forensic genetic genealogy. And the extraordinary thing about that breakthrough was that investigators had not found Miller by searching directly for him. They had found him by following the biological relationships hidden inside his DNA, essentially turning a crime scene into a family tree. And that method changed everything, because for decades the unknown male profile connected to April's murder had been almost useless as an identification tool. The DNA could establish that the same man was connected to certain pieces of evidence, but without a matching reference sample or a database entry identifying him, investigators had nowhere to go, and traditional detective work had reached a wall. But in 2018, that wall began to collapse when investigators worked with Parabon, Nanala, and genetic genealogists Cease Moore to analyze the DNA. The goal was not to guess a suspect. It was to identify biological relatives of the unknown offender and use those relationships to reconstruct his family history. And slowly the search produced a path toward 2 brothers in the Fort Wayne area, one of them John Miller, and suddenly a case that had spent 30 years asking who was responsible was asking a much more specific question. Which of these men was the source of the DNA? And that question could be answered scientifically, because genetic genealogy can narrow a field of possibilities, but investigators still need direct forensic confirmation before charging a person with a crime. So detectives began surveillance, watching Miller and gathering information about his movements and circumstances. And one detail immediately stood out. Miller lived in Grabit, Indiana, relatively close to the area where April's body had been found. But proximity alone was not enough, and investigators knew that because thousands of people could live within a reasonable distance of a crime scene without having anything to do with the crime, so the detectives needed something far stronger than geography. They needed his DNA, and they needed it without alerting him to the investigation, and that was where discarded material became crucial. Investigators covertly collected items from Miller's trash, including used condoms, material that could potentially contain his DNA, and when the laboratory compared the genetic material with the profile developed from the April Tinsley investigation, the result was the confirmation investigators had been seeking. Miller's DNA matched the DNA profile associated with the evidence, and the 30-year mystery suddenly had a biological identity. But the most dramatic moment was still ahead, because on July 15, 2018, investigators went to Miller's home and asked him to accompany them to the Fort Wayne Police Department, and according to the probable cause affidavit, once he was advised of his rights and questioned about why police wanted to speak with him, Miller responded by saying April Tinsley, a chilling response because it suggested that he immediately understood the subject of the investigation, and investigators then confronted him with the evidence, and according to authorities, Miller admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by choking her, transforming a case that had depended for decades on circumstantial questions into one involving an alleged admission from the man whose DNA had been recovered from the investigation. But even as the arrest made headlines across the country, there was a larger story developing behind the scenes because April's case had never been forgotten by the people who investigated it, and every generation of detectives had inherited a file containing the same terrible facts. An 8-year-old girl disappeared. Her body was found 3 days later. Biological evidence was recovered, and the killer remained unknown, and the passage of time had created a strange contradiction. The case was old, but the evidence was still alive, and that became increasingly important as forensic technology advanced, because evidence does not necessarily become worthless simply because decades have passed, provided it has been properly preserved, and April's case became a dramatic demonstration of that principle. The DNA collected in 1988 could not identify its source at the time, but decades later, it became the foundation of a genetic genealogy investigation that ultimately led detectives to Miller. And the case also contained another disturbing piece of evidence that had survived from the early years: the message written on a barn in 1990. A message claiming responsibility for April's murder, and when investigators later examined the handwriting, the contents, and the circumstances surrounding the message, it became another piece of the puzzle, because the writer appeared to know details connected to the crime that would not necessarily have been public knowledge, including the missing shoe, and the message suggested that whoever wrote it wanted to demonstrate control over the investigation and the community, but the identity of the writer remained unknown for years, and that uncertainty created a frightening possibility that the person responsible for April's death was still watching the investigation from a distance, still aware of what police knew, and still confident that he would never be identified. And that confidence appeared again in the early 2000s, when investigators began receiving new evidence connected to April's case, because used condoms and messages were discovered in the Fort Wayne area, and some of those messages claimed that the writer was responsible for abducting, raping, and killing April. Investigators collected the material and submitted it for DNA testing, and the results created another extraordinary connection. The biological material associated with those later incidents was consistent with the same male DNA profile recovered from April's clothing, meaning that investigators were no longer dealing with a single isolated forensic clue. They had a continuing genetic connection, and that connection suggested that the person who had written the messages and left the biological material was the same person whose DNA had been preserved from the original murder investigation. And yet, even then, the name remained hidden because the DNA could tell investigators that one man was responsible for the biological evidence, but it could not tell them where that man lived, what he looked like, or what name appeared on his driver's license. And that is why the emergence of forensic genetic genealogy was so significant. It offered investigators a new way to cross the gap between biology and identity, and the process was painstaking because genetic genealogists do not simply type a DNA profile into a public website and receive the answer. Instead, they analyze genetic relationships, identify possible relatives, build family trees, compare generations, and eliminate branches that do not fit the available evidence. And in April's case, the investigation eventually narrowed toward Miller and his brother, providing detectives with a realistic path forward. But even after the genetic genealogy work pointed toward Miller, investigators did not treat the result as proof. They continued working to obtain direct DNA confirmation, and the trash collection provided precisely that, turning a genealogical lead into a forensic identification. And this distinction is critical because genetic genealogy is an investigative tool, while a direct DNA comparison can provide the evidence needed to establish that a particular person is the source of biological material recovered in a criminal investigation. And once Miller's discarded DNA matched the profile, the case changed from an unknown offender investigation into a suspect investigation, and the detectives could begin asking questions that had been impossible for 30 years. Where had Miller been in 1988? What was his connection to the area? What did he know about April, and why had his DNA been recovered from evidence connected to her murder? And the answers would become increasingly disturbing because, according to the probable cause affidavit, Miller eventually admitted his involvement, and his alleged statements gave investigators information about the crime that could be compared with evidence already collected. But the most important thing was that the physical evidence had already led investigators to him before the admission, which meant the case did not depend entirely on a confession, and that was a crucial difference from the failed investigation of another famous Indiana cold case, where authorities had once struggled to establish the identity of an offender without strong forensic evidence. The biological trail had survived, and modern technology had converted that trail into a name. And as news of Miller's arrest spread, the story immediately attracted national attention because the phrase 30-year-old cold case solved by DNA captured something almost cinematic. A child murdered in 1988, an unidentified biological profile preserved for decades, a mysterious message on a barn, disturbing evidence appearing again years later, and finally, a genetic genealogy investigation that led police to a man living quietly in the same region. But behind the dramatic headline was something much more painful. April's family had waited for 30 years, and no technological breakthrough could return the time that had been lost. Her parents had spent decades carrying the unanswered question of who had taken their daughter, and every anniversary of April's disappearance and death reopened the wound, while investigators faced the same frustration every time the case failed to produce an identification. And now the arrest offered something they had not had before, a person to hold responsible, but responsibility would have to be established through the legal process, and the investigation still had to move forward because an arrest is an allegation, not a conviction, and the evidence would eventually have to survive scrutiny in court. While prosecutors prepared the case, investigators continued examining the decades-old evidence, and April's story returned to public view, not as the mystery of an unknown killer, but as the story of a child whose name had finally led investigators to the man accused of taking her life. And the passage of 30 years suddenly became part of the evidence itself, because the length of the investigation demonstrated how far forensic science had come, from a DNA sample that could not identify anyone in 1988 to genetic genealogy capable of narrowing a suspect through distant family connections in 2018. And that transformation was more than technological. It was a reminder that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes it is simply a case waiting for the right method, the right database, the right laboratory, or the right investigator to ask a question that previous generations could not answer. And in April Tinsley's case, that question had finally produced a name, John D. Miller. But identifying him was only the beginning, because investigators now had to reconstruct the final hours of April's life, examine every piece of evidence that connected Miller to the crime, and confront the most haunting question of all: how had the man accused of killing an 8-year-old girl managed to remain free for 3 decades while the evidence pointing toward him quietly survived in police storage, waiting for science to unlock it? The arrest of John D. Miller created a shockwave through Fort Wayne because the man investigators had spent 30 years searching for was not a mysterious stranger who had vanished into another state or disappeared overseas. He was a local man, a man whose life had continued while April Tinsley's family remained trapped in the moment when their daughter disappeared. And as investigators began reconstructing Miller's history, the case became even more unsettling because the question was no longer simply how forensic genealogy had found him, but how close the truth had been all along, and whether the killer had been moving through the same communities where April's family had spent decades asking for answers. Because on April 1st, 1988, April had been only 8 years old when she disappeared while walking toward a friend's home, and the ordinary nature of that journey made the crime particularly frightening. There was no complicated travel itinerary, no remote location, no mysterious disappearance from an airport, just a child walking a short distance who never arrived. And when her body was discovered 3 days later in a rural area of DeKalb County, the investigation immediately became one of the most urgent cases in the region. Detectives knew they were searching for someone who had committed an extraordinarily serious crime, but they did not know his identity. And the physical evidence collected from April would eventually become the silent witness that refused to disappear. Biological material recovered from her clothing contained a male DNA profile, but in 1988, that profile could not produce a name, and investigators were forced to continue their search through traditional methods, interviewing witnesses, examining the area, checking possible suspects, and attempting to understand the circumstances surrounding April's disappearance. But the investigation eventually encountered the problem that defines so many cold cases. The evidence existed, yet the technology needed to interpret it had not caught up with the crime. And while detectives were searching for answers, April's killer apparently believed he had escaped. But then, 2 years after the murder, the case was disturbed by a bizarre and frightening message. Words were written on a barn near Fort Wayne claiming responsibility for April's death. And the message referred to details associated with the crime, including her missing shoe, transforming the investigation again because now there appeared to be someone deliberately communicating with the outside world, someone who wanted investigators to know that the person responsible was still beyond their reach. And the message created a terrifying possibility that the killer was not merely hiding, he was watching, following the investigation closely enough to know what information was circulating and confident enough to taunt the authorities. But investigators could not turn that confidence into an identity, and the years continued to pass. April's name remained attached to the phrase unsolved murder, and her family continued living with an absence that never became easy simply because time moved forward. And then came another extraordinary development in 2004 when investigators began receiving messages connected to used condoms found in the Fort Wayne area, and some of the messages claimed responsibility for April's kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder, creating a disturbing connection between the decades-old crime and a new series of incidents. Investigators immediately recognized the potential significance of the biological material, and laboratory testing revealed that the DNA associated with the condoms was consistent with the male DNA recovered from April's underwear, meaning that the same unknown man appeared to be connected to both the original murder evidence and the later material. And this was a major breakthrough. But it was also a cruel one, because investigators now knew more about the offender without knowing who he was. The DNA profile had become stronger as an investigative tool, but it still did not have a name attached to it. And for more than a decade, that problem remained, until the emergence of forensic genetic genealogy changed what investigators could do with an unidentified DNA profile. And in 2008, Fort Wayne Police Detective Brian Martin pursued the possibility of using advanced genetic analysis to identify the unknown offender, bringing in Parabon Nanolabs, a company known for applying genetic technology to difficult criminal investigations, and genetic genealogist Cease Moore examined the data, searching for distant biological relationships that could lead investigators toward the offender's family. And this was fundamentally different from traditional DNA database searching, because investigators did not necessarily need the killer himself to have submitted DNA somewhere. They needed relatives, even distant ones, whose genetic information could provide enough connections to begin reconstructing a family tree, and gradually the investigation moved from an anonymous DNA profile toward actual family names, narrowing the possible relatives until investigators reached two brothers in the Fort Wayne area, one of them John D. Miller, and suddenly the case had something it had never possessed before, a specific person whose DNA could potentially be compared directly with the evidence from April's murder. But investigators understood that genealogy alone was not enough, because the genetic relationship between distant relatives can identify a family line without necessarily identifying the offender, and therefore detectives needed direct confirmation. So they began watching Miller, gathering information, studying his movements, and looking for an opportunity to obtain his DNA without alerting him. And the opportunity came through discarded material, because investigators could legally examine items that had been thrown away and potentially recover biological material from them. And according to court documents, detectives covertly collected items from Miller's trash, including used condoms, and submitted the material for testing. And then came the result that changed the case forever. Miller's DNA matched the male profile connected to April Tinsley's murder, and after 30 years, the unknown offender finally had a name. But the investigators still had to move carefully because a DNA match was not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of the legal process, and on July 15th, 2008, detectives went to Miller's residence and asked him to accompany them to the Fort Wayne Police Department, where they advised him of his rights and began questioning him. And according to the probable cause affidavit, when investigators asked whether he understood why they wanted to speak with him, Miller responded, "April Tinsley," 2 words that carried an enormous weight because they indicated that he immediately understood the subject of the interrogation, and investigators then confronted him with the evidence, and according to authorities, Miller admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by choking her, and those alleged admissions added another layer to the forensic case because the investigators now had not only DNA evidence, but statements that could be compared with the established facts of the crime. And for the Tinsley family, the arrest finally transformed decades of uncertainty into something tangible. There was now a person accused of killing their daughter, a name they could associate with the crime, and a legal process that could finally determine responsibility. But the emotional impact of that moment could not be measured by the word arrest, because for April's family, the case had never been simply an investigation. It had been 30 years of birthdays without their daughter, anniversaries marked by grief, questions that could not be answered, and the constant knowledge that somewhere the person responsible was living a life that April never had the chance to live. And now that person had been identified, yet the identification also forced the family to confront the terrible reality of what investigators believed had happened to April, and the details of the crime remained painful because April had been sexually assaulted and killed by asphyxiation, and her body had been left in a rural ditch, a location far removed from the ordinary route she had been walking that day, and the discovery had devastated a community that had struggled to understand how such a crime could happen to a child. And now, 30 years later, the investigation was revealing that the man accused of killing her had apparently remained in the same general region, creating an almost unbearable sense of proximity between the past and the present. And yet investigators could not change the past. They could only establish what the evidence showed, and what the evidence showed was extraordinary. The biological material collected in 1988 had survived. The DNA profile had survived. The later evidence had reinforced the same genetic identity. The genetic genealogy investigation had narrowed the search to a family, and direct testing had identified John D. Miller, turning a faceless offender into a named suspect. And that progression became one of the most important aspects of the case because it demonstrated how modern forensic science can transform investigations that once seemed impossible. But it also demonstrated something dark. The killer had not been caught because someone suddenly remembered seeing him, or because an eyewitness finally came forward after 30 years. He was identified because the evidence had been preserved and technology had evolved enough to interpret it. And that distinction mattered because the case was a reminder that time does not always destroy the truth. Sometimes it simply delays the moment when investigators can understand it. And as prosecutors prepared the case against Miller, they could now examine his history, his movements, his statements, and the forensic evidence with a suspect firmly in their sight. But they also had to establish the legal facts surrounding April's death, because an arrest is an accusation, and every accusation must survive the courtroom. And while the investigation moved toward prosecution, the public began asking questions that had remained unanswered for 3 decades. Why April? Why had the killer targeted an 8-year-old child? How had he managed to remain unidentified for so long? And why had he returned to the case through messages and biological evidence years later? Some of those questions could be answered through evidence, while others would remain forever trapped inside the mind of the offender. And that uncertainty gave the case its enduring darkness, because identifying a killer does not necessarily explain the motive behind a crime, and even an admission may never fully explain why one life was chosen and another was spared. But there was one thing the arrest finally accomplished. It ended the uncertainty over the identity of the man investigators believed was responsible, and April's name was no longer attached to an unknown offender. She had become the victim of a case that had finally been broken open by science, and as investigators prepared for the next stage, the evidence was no longer sleeping inside an old file. It was moving toward a courtroom where 30 years of questions would confront a single man, and where the silent DNA profile that had waited since 1988 would finally become part of the public record. For 30 years, April Tinsley's murder had existed in a strange space between certainty and mystery because investigators knew a child had been abducted and killed. They knew biological evidence had been recovered. They knew a man had apparently claimed responsibility more than once, and yet they did not know the name of the person behind any of it. But now, with John D. Miller identified through genetic genealogy and a direct DNA comparison, investigators could finally look backward with a suspect in mind, and that changed the meaning of almost everything inside the old case file, because evidence that once seemed anonymous could now be examined against a specific individual, and the deeper investigators went, the more extraordinary the story became, not because the evidence had suddenly appeared, but because it had been waiting for decades, preserved through years of technological limitations, waiting for science to become capable of answering the question that detectives in 1988 could not answer. And at the center of that evidence was DNA, the invisible biological signature that had survived from the original investigation. And the significance of that evidence cannot be overstated, because in the late 1980s, forensic DNA analysis was still a developing technology, and although investigators could recover biological material, the ability to generate a profile and compare it against a suspect was far more limited than it would become decades later. So the evidence from April's clothing remained essentially unidentified genetic fingerprint, powerful in theory but unable to produce a name, and that anonymous profile followed the case through the years, through changing investigators, changing technology, and changing investigative strategies, until new evidence appeared in 2004 and demonstrated that the profile was not simply a relic from an old crime, because biological material connected to later messages was consistent with the same male DNA profile, suggesting that the person behind those later incidents was the same man whose biological evidence had been recovered in connection with April. And that development should have been terrifying enough, because it meant that investigators were not searching for a completely unknown offender who had vanished into history. They were searching for a living man whose genetic signature was still appearing in evidence, yet the identity remained hidden. And that is what made the eventual genetic genealogy breakthrough so extraordinary, because traditional forensic databases had not produced the answer. But genealogy offered another route, one that did not require the offender himself to appear in a database. Instead, investigators could follow biological relatives, identify branches of a family, and gradually narrow the possibilities. And when Parabon Nanolabs analyzed the DNA and genetic genealogists cease, more began examining the relationships. The unknown offender stopped being a faceless genetic profile and started becoming part of a family tree. And that family tree eventually led investigators toward two brothers in the Fort Wayne area, one of whom was John D. Miller, and suddenly the case became intensely personal, because investigators were no longer staring at a laboratory report containing an unknown male. They were looking at a man with a home, a history, a neighborhood, and a life. And yet detectives understood that the genetic genealogy result was not enough to simply declare him guilty, because the genealogy analysis provided an investigative look, not the final forensic confirmation required to establish that Miller was the source of the crime scene DNA. And so the detective began a quiet operation designed to obtain his DNA without alerting him, and that operation led them to his discarded trash, where investigators recovered biological material from items that had been thrown away, including used condoms. And those objects became critical because they could provide a direct DNA comparison. And when laboratory testing established that Miller's DNA matched the profile associated with the April Tinsley investigation, the investigation crossed a line it had been unable to cross for 3 decades. The unknown offender now had an identity, and investigators could move from genealogy to traditional criminal investigation, from family trees to interviews, surveillance, evidence collection, and eventually an arrest. But there was another layer to the story, because the identification of Miller forced investigators to revisit the strange messages that had appeared over the years, particularly the barn message from 1990, the later material discovered in 2004, and these communications had always been disturbing because they suggested that the offender was not content simply to disappear. He appeared to want recognition, and the barn message was especially significant because it referenced April and details connected to the crime, including her missing shoe, a detail that made the message far more chilling than an ordinary anonymous threat, because it suggested knowledge of the investigation, and whether the person responsible wrote every message personally was a question that had to be examined carefully. But the DNA evidence provided concrete connection that words alone could never establish, and that distinction mattered, because the investigation could now separate what was proven from what was merely suspected. And in cold cases, that discipline is crucial, especially when decades of speculation have accumulated around a victim and a crime, because over time, rumors become memories, memories become assumptions, and assumptions can begin to look like facts. But forensic evidence operates differently. It can be tested, compared, challenged, and verified, and the DNA match to Miller provided investigators with a foundation that did not depend on rumor, while the later investigative steps provided additional context, and then came the interrogation, when detectives brought Miller to the Fort Wayne Police Department after approaching him at his residence. And according to the probable cause affidavit, once he was advised of his rights and asked whether he understood why police wanted to talk to him, he answered, April Tinsley. And that response would become one of the most memorable moments in the case, because it suggested that Miller knew exactly what investigators were investigating before they had fully explained the purpose of the meeting. And according to authorities, he later admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by choking her, statements that prosecutors could place alongside the DNA evidence and the physical circumstances of the crime. But even with an alleged confession, the case remained a legal process, and investigators still had to preserve the chain of evidence and establish the facts in a courtroom, because the purpose of a criminal investigation is not simply to identify someone. It is to establish responsibility through evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny, and the April Tinsley investigation had already experienced the consequences of uncertainty, so investigators now had to make sure that every forensic step was documented and defensible. And as prosecutors prepared the case, the public began to understand just how unusual the investigation had been, because this was not a case solved by a sudden eyewitness confession or a forgotten fingerprint. It was solved through a combination of old evidence and new science, with the DNA collected in 1988 becoming the starting point for genetic genealogy 30 years later. And that development transformed April's case into a landmark example of how genealogy databases could assist law enforcement in identifying unknown suspects, and the implications reached far beyond Fort Wayne, because investigators around the country were beginning to recognize that cold cases containing unidentified DNA might have another path forward, even when conventional forensic databases produced no match. And April's case became part of that rapidly changing landscape, where family relationships could become investigative leads and distant relatives could unknowingly help detectives identify an offender. But for April as family, the technological significance was secondary to something much more human. They finally knew who investigators believed had taken their daughter, and after 30 years of uncertainty, that knowledge carried an emotional weight that statistics and laboratory reports could never express, because April had not simply been a case, she had been a child, and every year that passed without an answer meant another year in which her parents had to live with the possibility that the person responsible might never be found. And now that possibility had changed. The person had a name, investigators had a DNA match, and prosecutors had an alleged admission. But there was still the question of what would happen next, because an arrest does not automatically bring closure, and a confession does not erase the crime, and a DNA match cannot return a child to the family who lost her. And perhaps that is the cruelest reality of every cold case. Solving the mystery does not reverse the past. It only changes what the living must carry forward. And April's family had spent decades carrying uncertainty, while now they would have to carry knowledge. And knowledge can be both a relief and a burden, because knowing the identity of the person responsible can answer one question while creating 100 others. Why did he do it? Why did he choose April? What happened during those final hours, and what other things did he remember that nobody else could ever know? And some of those questions might never have complete answers, even after the investigation was solved, because criminal evidence can establish events without explaining every motive, and that distinction is especially important in a case involving a child, because the human mind naturally searches for a reason behind something that seems impossible to comprehend. But sometimes there is no explanation that can make the act understandable, and investigators could only reconstruct what the evidence supported, not manufacture a motive where none could be established. And while the legal case moved forward, the story of April herself remained at the center of everything, because the investigation existed only because a little girl had been taken from her family on an ordinary spring day, and every laboratory test, every genealogy chart, every surveillance operation, and every interview was ultimately an attempt to answer the question that her family had been asking since 1988. Who did this to her? And for 3 decades, the answer had been hidden inside a biological trace. But now the trace had become a name, and the name had become an arrest, and the arrest would soon become a courtroom battle over evidence, responsibility, and justice. And the closer that moment came, the more investigators had to confront the full history of the case, because the murder had not existed in isolation. The barn message, the later DNA evidence, the missing shoe, the rural crime scene, and the biological material preserved from April's clothing all formed pieces of a story that had taken 30 years to assemble. And perhaps the most haunting part was that none of those pieces had ever truly disappeared. They had simply waited, silent and inert, while technology changed around them. And when science finally caught up, the evidence began speaking with a clarity that the investigation had never possessed before, pointing toward a man who had lived through 3 decades while April's family waited. And on that summer day in 2018, the distance between the crime suspect finally collapsed, leaving investigators with one task remaining: to prove in court that the man identified by the DNA was the same man responsible for the terrible events of April 1st, 1988. And after 30 years of unanswered questions, the final chapter was no longer somewhere in the future. It was already beginning. For 30 years, April Tinsley's family had lived with a question that could not be answered, a question that followed them through birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary moments when the absence of an 8-year-old girl suddenly became impossible to ignore. And now that John D. Miller had been identified through DNA and genetic genealogy, the investigation was entering its most painful stage, because the family was no longer waiting to learn whether April's killer could be found. They were preparing to hear what investigators believed had happened to her, and those details would force them to confront the final hours of a child whose life had ended on a spring day in 1988. But before the courtroom could become the center of the story, detectives had to build the case carefully, because Miller's arrest had produced a dramatic breakthrough, yet prosecutors still needed evidence capable of establishing the charges beyond a reasonable doubt, and the evidence was already there, preserved across decades, beginning with the biological material recovered from April's clothing, material that had produced the unidentified male DNA profile that remained in the case for years, and then the later evidence recovered in 2004, which investigators said carried the same DNA profile, creating a continuous biological thread connecting the original murder to the later messages and materials, and finally the covert collection of Miller's discarded material, which produced the direct comparison that investigators needed. And on July 9, 2018, the Indiana State Police Laboratory informed detectives that the DNA profile from the used condoms recovered from Miller's trash was consistent with the profile recovered from the condoms found in 2004 and the DNA recovered from April's underwear in 1988. The significance of that laboratory result was enormous, because it meant that 3 decades of investigative uncertainty had been reduced to a direct forensic connection, and investigators now had a reason to believe that the man living in a modest trailer in Greville was the same man whose biological evidence had been connected to April since the day her body was discovered. But detectives did not stop with the DNA because they needed to understand Miller's own account of what happened. And on July 15, investigators approached him outside his residence and asked him to accompany them to the Fort Wayne Police Department, where he agreed to speak with them, was advised of his rights, and then faced the question that would become one of the most chilling moments of the entire investigation when detectives asked whether he knew why they wanted to talk to him. Miller looked at them and said, "April Tinsley, according to the probable cause affidavit." The words were simple, but their meaning was enormous because detectives had not yet fully explained the subject of the interview. Yet Miller immediately connected the meeting with April's name, and when investigators told him they had a DNA match, they asked him to explain what had happened, and according to the affidavit, Miller initially said he could not, before eventually admitting that he had abducted April from Fort Wayne on April 1st, 1988, taken her to his trailer in Greville, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by choking her, later telling detectives that he had taken her body to County Road 68 and left it there. And according to the same account, he also described returning to the area afterward and disposing of one of April's shoes, details that investigators could compare with evidence from the original crime scene. The confession, if presented and accepted in court, would provide a devastating narrative, but the investigators already had something that did not depend on Miller's words, the DNA, and that mattered because the strength of the case rested on multiple independent elements pointing toward the same conclusion, and as detectives continued their work, they were also able to revisit Miller's location, his history, and the circumstances surrounding his life in the area, and the geography became particularly disturbing because Miller had continued living in the Fort Wayne region, eventually residing in a trailer in Greville, not far from where April's body had been discovered, meaning that the man investigators now believed had killed her had spent decades living in the same broad community where the crime had remained an open wound, and yet nobody had connected him to the murder, and that realization created one of the most unsettling questions in the entire case. How had someone apparently so close to the investigation remained invisible for so long? And the answer appeared to involve several factors, including his private lifestyle, the limitations of the investigative technology available in 1988, and the absence of a DNA database match capable of identifying him. But there was another possibility that investigators had to consider. Perhaps people had seen him. Perhaps they had encountered him. Perhaps they had even heard his name, yet nothing had connected those ordinary observations to the murder of April Tinsley. And that is one of the cruel characteristics of cold cases. A suspect can live among thousands of people without appearing suspicious because there is no visible sign announcing that he carries a terrible secret. And for decades, Miller remained part of the landscape while April's family remained trapped in the past. And when the arrest became public, the emotional reaction was immediate because the family had spent so long hearing that the case remained unresolved that the arrival of a suspect felt almost unreal. And April's mother, Janet, had to process the news that the person investigators believed responsible for her daughter's death had finally been identified. But relief was inseparable from grief because solving the case did not give April back, and it did not erase the years that her family had spent without her. And as the legal proceedings began, Miller was initially facing extremely serious charges, including murder-related charges, child molestation, and criminal confinement, and the possibility of the death penalty became part of the public discussion, creating intense pressure around what would happen next. But prosecutors and the defense eventually negotiated a plea agreement, and the decision was not universally easy for April's family because some relatives wanted the strongest possible punishment and wanted the case to go to trial, while prosecutors were also considering the burden that a trial could place on the family, requiring them to relive the evidence and hear painful details publicly. And that tension would become central to the final legal chapter because justice can mean different things to different people, especially after decades of waiting. And for a family that has spent 30 years demanding answers, the idea of accepting a plea instead of a full trial can feel like another compromise imposed by circumstances, but there was also a practical reality. Miller had already been connected to the evidence through DNA, and according to investigators, he had admitted responsibility, making the possibility of a conviction through a negotiated plea highly significant. And eventually the case moved toward a resolution that would prevent the death penalty while ensuring that Miller would spend decades behind bars. And in December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty to the charges in the agreement and received an 80-year prison sentence. Reports describe the sentence as effectively keeping him imprisoned for the remainder of his life. The courtroom became the place where 30 years of uncertainty finally collided with a legal judgment, and for April's family, seeing Miller in front of them was unlike anything they had experienced before, because for decades the killer had been an invisible figure, a name that did not exist, a face that could not be identified, and suddenly there was a man sitting inside the courtroom while April's photograph represented the child whose life he had taken, and Janet Tinsley chose to sit where Miller could see her, carrying with her the memory of the daughter who had never been allowed to grow up. And when she spoke, the words were not simply part of a sentencing hearing. They were the voice of a mother who had spent 3 decades carrying unanswered questions, and one question remained particularly painful. Why April? Why had this child been chosen? Why had an ordinary walk toward a friendless home ended with an investigation lasting 30 years? And even after the legal process provided an answer about who was responsible, the question of why could never be answered in a way that could make the crime understandable, because there is no explanation capable of making the murder of an 8-year-old child acceptable, and perhaps that is why the case continued to feel unfinished even after the conviction, because justice had finally established responsibility. But grief does not follow the same rules as a courtroom. Grief does not end when a judge announces a sentence, and it does not disappear when the prison doors close. It remains, changing shape, but never completely leaving. And April's family would continue to remember the girl rather than allowing the killer to define her entire story. Because April had been more than a victim, she had been a daughter, a sister, a cousin, a child with a future that was stolen before it could begin, and the investigation that followed her death ultimately transformed her name into something larger than the crime itself, because April Tinsley became one of the earliest major cases in which forensic genetic genealogy helped identify an unknown murder suspect, demonstrating that a DNA profile that had remained anonymous for decades could eventually become the key to a real human identity. And the implications spread far beyond Indiana, because investigators around the United States began looking more seriously at old cases containing unidentified DNA, realizing that genetic genealogy could potentially open doors that conventional databases could not. But the breakthrough also raised difficult questions about privacy, genealogy databases, and the boundaries between family history and criminal investigation, because relatives who had never been involved in a crime could potentially help identify someone connected to them without knowing that they're genetic. Information would become part of an investigation, and those debates would continue as the technology expanded. But in April's case, the result was unmistakable. A childless killer had been identified after 30 years, and the identification came not from a new eyewitness, not from a dramatic confession emerging from nowhere, but from evidence collected decades earlier and a technology that could finally interpret it. And perhaps the most haunting element was the passage of time itself, because while investigators waited for the science to advance, April's family continued aging. The little girl in the photographs remained forever 8 years old, while everyone who loved her moved through adulthood without her, and John Miller continued living his life under the radar, apparently believing that the past would never catch him. But the past had not disappeared. It had been preserved, encoded inside biological material that could not forget, and eventually the technology arrived that could translate that biological signature into a family tree, then into a suspect, and finally into an arrest. And when the case reached its conclusion, the word unknown could finally be removed from April's story, because the person responsible had been identified, convicted, and sentenced. But the deeper legacy of the case was not simply that one killer had been caught. It was that April's evidence had survived long enough to speak for her, and after 30 years of silence, that evidence finally told investigators exactly where to look. For April Tinsley S. family, the 80-year sentence imposed on John D. Miller could never be mistaken for the return of normal life because there was no normal life to return to, not after April disappeared in 1988, not after her body was found 3 days later, and certainly not after 30 years of unanswered questions, but the conviction did establish something that had once seemed almost impossible. The man responsible had finally been identified, and the evidence that brought him to justice had come from a source investigators in 1988 could barely have imagined a combination of preserved DNA, advanced genetic analysis, public genealogy information, and traditional detective work, and that combination transformed April's case from one of Indiana's most haunting unsolved murders into a landmark example of what modern forensic genealogy could accomplish. But the story of the breakthrough was not as simple as a computer suddenly producing a suspect's name, because behind the dramatic headlines was a painstaking investigation that required scientists and detectives to work backward through generations of biological relationship, and every step mattered because one mistake in the family tree could send investigators down the wrong path. One unrelated genetic connection could create a false lead, and one unsupported assumption could destroy years of investigative work. So the process had to be careful, methodical, and eventually verified through direct DNA evidence, and that distinction became essential to understanding why the April Tinsley investigation was so important, because the genealogy analysis did not itself prove that John D. Miller had killed April. It helped investigators find a family line that could lead them toward the unknown offender. And once investigators identified Miller as a possible suspect, they still had to obtain his DNA and compare it directly with the evidence from the murder investigation, and that direct comparison was the moment when the theory became forensic evidence, because the DNA recovered from Miller's discarded material matched the profile associated with April's case, and that result gave detectives the foundation they needed to approach him, question him, and eventually arrest him. And when Miller reportedly answered April Tinsley after investigators asked why he believed they wanted to speak with him, the moment became unforgettable, because after 30 years, the name of the murdered child was suddenly being spoken by the man investigators believed had killed her. And according to the probable cause affidavit, Miller then provided investigators with a detailed account of the crime, including the abduction, assault, killing, and disposal of April's body, and those statements were significant because they could be compared against details already known from the investigation, including the location where April's body had been discovered and the evidence associated with this. And suddenly, the old case file had something it had lacked for decades: a suspect, a DNA match, and an alleged confession. But the case was also becoming something much larger than one prosecution, because investigators around the country were beginning to recognize that thousands of unsolved murders contained biological evidence that had never produced an identification. And if genetic genealogy could be used responsibly, some of those cases might finally have another path forward. And April's case became one of the clearest demonstrations of that possibility, because the evidence had been sitting there since 1988, waiting for a technology capable of turning an anonymous profile into an investigative lead. And the timing was remarkable, because the science emerged decades after April's death, but still in time to identify the person responsible. And that raised a powerful question about all the other victims whose cases had been left unresolved because the necessary technology did not yet exist. How many families were still waiting? How many unidentified DNA profiles remained locked inside evidence rooms? And how many killers believed that time itself would protect them? And the answer was impossible to know. But the April investigation suggested that the passage of time might not always favor the offender. Sometimes it favored the evidence, because every year that passed brought advances in DNA analysis, computing power, genealogy databases, and forensic methods, and an evidence sample that had once been considered insufficient for identification could eventually become useful in ways nobody had anticipated, and that principle became one of the strongest lessons from April's case Evidence should be preserved even when investigators cannot immediately see how it will be used, because the future may possess tools that the present does not. And the story of April's DNA demonstrated that perfectly the sample collected after her murder did not expire simply because the investigation went cold. It remained a biological record of the crime. And when genetic genealogy emerged, investigators could return to that record and ask a completely different question. Not, does this DNA match someone already in the system? But who are this person's relatives? And that change in the question changed the investigation itself, because traditional forensic databases depend on the offender or another legally available reference profile already being present, while genetic genealogy can sometimes identify distant relatives who have voluntarily submitted their DNA for genealogical purposes, creating a completely different investigative pathway. And in April's case, that pathway eventually led toward Miller, but the breakthrough also exposed a complicated ethical landscape, because genealogy databases were created primarily to help people discover their ancestry, connect with relatives, and explore family history, not to function as criminal databases. And when law enforcement began using genetic genealogy in serious investigations, questions immediately emerged about privacy, consent, and the rights of innocent relatives, because a person could submit DNA simply to learn about their ancestors and unknowingly create a genetic connection that investigators might later use to identify a distant relative suspected of a violent crime. And these questions became increasingly important as the technique spread. But in the April Tinsley investigation, the result was a case that demonstrated both the extraordinary power and the extraordinary responsibility of the technology, because investigators were dealing with a child homicide that had remained unresolved for 30 years, and the biological evidence provided a rare opportunity to identify the offender. Yet every step still had to be validated through traditional forensic methods and legal procedure, and that balance between new technology and established investigation became a defining feature of the case, because the genetic genealogy lead was only one part of the process. Detectives still had to locate Miller, obtain his DNA, establish the match, question him, and build the prosecution. And that meant the old-fashioned work of policing never disappeared. It simply gained a new tool. And the story of April also demonstrated the importance of collaboration, because no single investigator could have solved the case alone. Detectives had to work with forensic laboratories, genetic research, genealogists, prosecutors, and other specialists, and the case became a bridge between disciplines that had traditionally operated separately, law enforcement on one side, genealogy and genetics on the other, and together they created a method capable of reaching into the past and identifying a person who had remained invisible for decades. And the impact was immediate, because when news broke that April's killer had been identified through genetic genealogy, families across the country began wondering whether their own cold cases might have similar possibilities, and police departments began reviewing old evidence, particularly cases involving unidentified biological material, looking for opportunities to apply emerging technology. And the phrase cold case began to acquire a different meaning, because a cold case no longer necessarily meant a case that had exhausted every possibility. It could mean a case waiting for a technological breakthrough, and that distinction gave hope to families who had spent decades hearing that there were no new leads. But hope also had to be handled carefully, because not every DNA sample is suitable for genetic genealogy. Not every case contains usable biological evidence, and not every genealogical lead will produce a definitive suspect, so investigators could not promise families that technology would solve every mystery. But April's case proved that some mysteries could be reopened in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. And for the Tinsley family, the most important result was still intensely personal. April's killer was no longer an unidentified man. The family knew his name. They knew he had been convicted, and they knew he would spend the rest of his life in prison. But they also had to live with the knowledge that the man had remained free for 3 decades, and that fact could never be completely separated from the story, because every year Miller spent outside prison represented another year during which April's family had no answer. and another year during which they had no certainty that justice would ever come. And that is why the case cannot be reduced to a technological success story, because beneath the DNA charts and genealogy trees was a child whose life ended before she could grow up, and beneath the courtroom victory was a family that had endured an extraordinary amount of grief, and beneath the 80-year sentence was a question that technology could never answer. What might April's life have looked like if she had survived? Nobody could know, and no forensic breakthrough could reconstruct the future that had been stolen from her, but investigators could preserve her past, and that is exactly what the evidence ultimately did. It preserved the biological trait, preserved the crime scene, preserved the investigative record, and preserved the possibility that someday the truth could be discovered. And when that day finally came, it proved something that investigators and families had been forced to believe for years without knowing whether it was true. A case can be silent without being forgotten. Evidence can be dormant without being useless, and a killer can remain unidentified without being beyond the reach of justice forever, because 30 years after April disappeared, science followed the trail that traditional investigation could not, and the trail ended at the door of John D. Miller, a man whose identity had been hidden from investigators for decades, but whose biological signature had never truly disappeared. And that was the final irony of the case. The killer had been protected by time only as long as investigators lacked the tools to interpret what he had left behind. But time was also preserving the very evidence that would eventually expose him. And once that evidence was connected to a family tree, then to a suspect, then to a direct DNA match, the mystery began collapsing with astonishing speed, and the little girl whose name had once appeared in headlines beside the words "unsolved murder" finally had an answer attached to it. Not an answer that could erase the past, but one that could establish responsibility, restore the historical record, and allow her family to say that after 30 years, the man who had taken April from them was finally behind bars. For investigators who had spent years trying to understand the murder of April Tinsley, one of the most disturbing elements was not simply that the killer had remained unidentified, but that someone appeared to have returned to the case years after April's death, leaving behind messages that seemed designed to reopen the wound. And those messages became increasingly important because they created a disturbing bridge between the original murder in 1988 and later incidents that investigators could finally connect through DNA, turning what had once seemed like isolated pieces of evidence into a continuous trail, a trail that would eventually lead to John D. Miller. And the first major warning had come in 1990 when a message was discovered painted on a barn near Fort Wayne, claiming responsibility for April's murder. And the words were deeply unsettling because they referenced April directly and included a detail associated with her disappearance, her missing shoe, making investigators wonder whether the person responsible was attempting to communicate with them, taunt them, or prove that he knew details about the crime that the public might not know. And for a community already traumatized by the murder of an 8-year-old girl, the message created a new fear because the killer was no longer simply an unknown figure who had disappeared into the night. He appeared to be reaching back into the investigation, reminding everyone that the person responsible might still be somewhere nearby, watching, waiting, and knowing that police had not found him. But investigators were unable to turn the message into a name, and without a direct forensic connection, the writing remained another unanswered question inside an already complicated case. And the years continued, with April's murder becoming one of those cases that seemed destined to remain permanently unresolved, a file filled with evidence but lacking the one thing investigators needed most, an identity. And then, more than a decade after April's death, the case was disturbed again, this time by evidence that would prove far more powerful than words written on a wall, because in 2004, authorities began finding used condoms and messages in the Fort Wayne area, and some of the messages claimed that the writer was the person responsible for abducting, sexually assaulting, and killing April, and investigators immediately recognized the possibility that they were dealing with the same offender, but suspicion alone could not establish the connection. So forensic scientists tested the biological material, and the results were extraordinary. The DNA associated with the later evidence was consistent with the male DNA profile recovered from April's underwear, creating a direct biological link between the 30-year-old murder and the later incidents. And suddenly, the case had something far more significant than a threatening message. It had a genetic signature, a signature that appeared to belong to the same man across different pieces of evidence separated by 16 years. But there was still one enormous problem. Investigators knew the DNA belonged to the same unknown male, but they did not know his name, and that meant the case had entered of the most frustrating stages imaginable because science had confirmed that the same person was connected to the evidence. Yet the identity remained hidden, and traditional DNA databases did not provide the answer, leaving detectives with an unknown profile that could be compared against evidence but not immediately translated into a person. And for the Tinsley family, that distinction was agonizing because they now had stronger evidence that the person responsible for April's death had left behind a biological trail. Yet the trail still seemed to disappear before reaching an actual name, and the case remained unresolved. But the world around forensic science was changing rapidly, and those changes would eventually make the impossible possible because genetic genealogy was emerging as a method for identifying unknown individuals through their biological relatives, and investigators began recognizing that a DNA profile did not have to match the offender directly to be useful. It could instead reveal the offender's family connection, and those connections could lead detectives through generations of relatives until the possible suspect emerged. And that approach would become the breakthrough April's case needed, but it required investigators to approach the old evidence differently, because for decades, the central question had been whether the unknown DNA matched anyone in a criminal database, while now the question became much broader. Who is genetically related to this unknown person, and what can those relationships reveal about his family, his location, and ultimately his identity? And in 2018, Fort Wayne detective Brian Martin pursued this new direction, working with Parabon Nanolabs and genetic genealogist Cease Moore to analyze the DNA profile. And what emerged from the analysis was not an instant name, but a network of genetic relationships, distant connections that could be mapped into a family structure. And as Moore and the investigators worked through the available information, the possibilities narrowed, eventually pointing toward two brothers in the Fort Wayne area. And one of those brothers was John D. Miller, a name that would soon become central to one of Indiana's most closely watched cold case investigation. But investigators could not simply arrest him because his name appeared at the end of a genealogical path, because genetic genealogy provides an investigative not automatic proof of criminal responsibility, and detectives needed a direct DNA sample from Miller, something that could be compared with the biological evidence collected from April's case and the later incidents, and they needed to obtain it without alerting him, because once a suspect knows police are watching, obtaining uncontaminated evidence can become far more difficult, and so investigators began surveillance, watching Miller and looking for an opportunity to collect discarded material, and eventually they recovered items from his track, including used condoms, objects that could potentially contain enough biological material for a definitive comparison, and the samples were submitted for laboratory analysis. And on July 9th, 2018, investigators received the result that would finally end the decades-long search. The DNA from Miller's discarded material matched the DNA profile connected to April's murder and the later evidence, and the anonymous male who had haunted the case since 1988 now had a name, John D. Miller. But the significance of the identification went beyond the simple fact that investigators had found a suspect, because Miller had not been identified through a conventional confession, an eyewitness, or a random tip. He had been identified through the biological relationships hidden inside the evidence from the crime itself, and that made the breakthrough one of the clearest examples of how genetic genealogy could reach into a cold case that conventional investigative methods had been unable to solve. And yet investigators still had one final challenge. They needed to confront Miller and determine what he would say when faced with the evidence. And on July 15th, detectives went to his residence and asked him to accompany them to the Fort Wayne Police Department, where he agreed to speak with them. And once inside, investigators advised him of his rights, then began asking questions. And according to the probable cause affidavit, when Miller was asked whether he understood why detectives wanted to talk to him, he answered April Tinsley, and the room suddenly contained the weight of 30 years because April's name had been spoken by the man investigators had spent decades trying to identify, and when detectives informed Miller that they had a DNA match, they asked him to explain his connection to April, and according to investigators, he eventually admitted that he had abducted her, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by choking her, then described taking her body to the area where it was later discovered, and those statements would become another critical element of the prosecution in this case. But the investigators had already established something even more powerful. The biological evidence had independently led them to Miller, meaning that the alleged confession did not create the case from nothing. It came after the forensic trail had already pointed toward him. And this distinction would matter when prosecutors presented the evidence because the case rested on a convergence of different sources. DNA recovered from April's clothing, DNA associated with later evidence, genetic genealogy leading toward Miller's family, direct DNA comparison connecting Miller to the profile, and his alleged statements during questioning. And the more those elements converged, the harder it became to explain the evidence as coincidence, and yet the case remained deeply disturbing because of the messages, especially the possibility that someone had deliberately taunted investigators after April's murder. And if Miller was responsible for those communications, then the messages suggested a psychological dimension that was impossible to ignore. A killer who did not simply want to disappear but wanted to demonstrate that he had escaped, and that behavior made the case even more haunting because it meant the offender might have been following the investigation while knowing that detectives lacked the technology to identify him, but whether every message could be conclusively attributed to him was a matter for evidence and legal proceedings, and investigators had to be careful not to confuse suspicion with proof because the history of cold cases contains many examples of theories that appeared convincing until forensic evidence contradicted them, and the April Tinsley investigation had to avoid that trap, especially after 3 decades of speculation, so the evidence had to lead. Not the story, and the evidence led toward Miller, first through biology, then through genealogy, then through direct DNA comparison, and finally through his own alleged statements. And as the investigation moved toward court, the family finally had something they had been denied for most of their lives: certainty about who investigators believed had killed April. But certainty about identity did not erase the grief surrounding the case because the messages and DNA could explain the investigation, yet they could not explain the law, and April's family still had to confront the fact that their daughter had been taken from them when she was only 8 years old, that her body had been found in a rural ditch, and that the man responsible had remained free for 3 decades. And perhaps the cruelest part was that April's parents had no way of knowing during those years that the evidence needed to identify her killer was already sitting inside the case file, waiting for technology to catch up. And while the killer continued living his life, the family continued living with uncertainty, but the evidence never stopped pointing toward the same biological source, and eventually investigators found a way to follow that source through generations, turning an anonymous DNA profile into a family tree, and a family tree into a suspect, and then the suspect into an identified offender, and the old messages that once seemed like fragments of a nightmare suddenly became part of a much larger story because the DNA connected the past and the present, showing that the biological trail had remained consistent even while the investigation changed. And when Miller was finally taken into custody in 2018, the words written decades earlier could no longer protect whoever had written them because the science had crossed the distance between evidence and identity, and the man who had remained hidden behind an unknown DNA profile now stood directly in front of investigators, no longer an invisible figure in a cold case, but a named defendant facing the consequences of a crime that had haunted Fort Wayne since 1988. And for April's family, the long silence had finally been broken. But the most difficult moment was still approaching because after 30 years of waiting, they would soon have to sit in a courtroom and hear the details of the crime spoken aloud, face the man accused of killing their daughter, and decide what justice could possibly mean after an entire generation had passed. For April Tinsley's family, the arrest of John D. Miller did something that had seemed impossible for 3 decades. It placed a face and a name beside the crime that had defined so much of their lives. But an arrest was not the same as justice, and the investigation still had to pass through the courtroom where every piece of evidence would be examined, challenged, and measured against the law. And that meant the story of April was about to move from a police investigation into a legal battle, a transition that would force everyone involved to confront the same terrible events from a different perspective because detectives had spent years asking who had killed April, forensic scientists had spent years studying biological evidence, genealogists had spent months reconstructing family relationships, and now prosecutors had to answer a different question. Could the evidence prove that John D. Miller was responsible beyond a reasonable doubt? The answer appeared to be supported by an extraordinary chain of evidence that stretched back to 1988, beginning with the DNA recovered during the original investigation, continuing through biological evidence connected to later incidents, and eventually reaching the DNA obtained from Miller after investigators identified him through genetic genealogy, and that chain mattered because it showed that the breakthrough had not been based on one isolated clue, but on several independent pieces of information converging on the same person. And when detectives confronted Miller, according to the probable cause affidavit, he knew exactly why they wanted to speak with him, responding with April's name before investigators had fully explained the purpose of the interview, and according to authorities, he subsequently admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by choking her, statements that prosecutor could place alongside the physical and forensic evidence already collected, and yet the legal system required more than a dramatic confession because every statement had to be evaluated according to the circumstances under which it was obtained. Every piece of physical evidence had to be properly documented, and every forensic result had to be supported by laboratory procedures. And that was especially important in a case more than 30 years old because the defense could challenge the reliability of memories, the preservation of evidence, the interpretation of laboratory results, and the investigative methods used decades earlier, meaning prosecutors had to construct a case strong enough to survive scrutiny from every direction. And as those preparations continued, the story of the genetic genealogy breakthrough became increasingly important because it demonstrated how investigators had moved from an unknown DNA profile to a possible family connection, and then from that family connection to Miller himself. But investigators still needed direct confirmation, and the DNA recovered from Miller's discarded material provided it, linking him to the same genetic profile associated with the evidence from April's murder, and that direct comparison became one of the most important pieces of the case because it transformed the genealogical led into conventional forensic evidence, and once Miller was identified, investigators could begin reconstructing his circumstances at the time of the murder, his connection to the region, and the physical locations described during his interview, and geography became particularly significant because Miller lived in Grabille, Indiana, an area close to where April's body had been discovered, and according to the account investigators obtained from him, he had taken April to his trailer before eventually transporting her body to the location where she was found. But the investigators did not need to rely solely on his version of events because the original crime scene had already established where April's body was discovered, and the forensic evidence had already established a biological connection to the unknown male, creating a framework against which Miller's statements could be tested. And this was one of the most important principles of the investigation. The evidence came first, and the suspect's statements could then be compared against it, rather than investigators building an entire case around an unsupported confession. And as the case moved toward prosecution, the passage of time became one of its defining features because 30 years separated the murder from the identification, meaning almost an entire generation had grown up without knowing the identity of April's killer, and children who were alive when April disappeared had become adults, while the little girl at the center of the case remained forever 8 years old, preserved in photographs and memories. And that contrast was devastating because time had continued for everyone except April, and her family had been forced to carry her absence through every stage of their lives. But now the legal system was finally moving toward a conclusion, and prosecutors faced a decision about how to resolve the case, because Miller was facing extremely serious charges, and a trial could potentially expose every painful detail of April's death in open court, forcing the family to relive the crime while giving the defense an opportunity to challenge the evidence. While a negotiated plea could provide a guaranteed conviction and a lengthy sentence without the uncertainty and emotional cost of a full trial, and those choices are never simple in a case involving the murder of a child, because families can understandably want the fullest possible punishment, while prosecutors must also consider the strength of the evidence, the interests of the victim's relatives, and the realities of obtaining a conviction. And in Miller's case, the prosecution eventually reached a plea agreement that resolved the case without a death penalty trial. And on December 27, 2018, Miller pleaded guilty in Allen County to the charges outlined in the agreement, bringing the courtroom phase of the case to its decisive moment. And the sentence that followed was 80 years in prison, a punishment that effectively ensured Miller would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. And the significance of that sentence went far beyond the number itself, because for 30 years, the person responsible had been unknown. And now the legal system had officially established his responsibility through his guilty plea, ending the uncertainty that had haunted the Tinsley family since 1988. But even then, the courtroom could not provide every answer, because a plea could establish responsibility without explaining every detail of motive, and there were questions that remained locked inside Miller's own memory, questions about why April had been targeted, what he had been thinking, and what had happened in every moment between her disappearance and the discovery of her body. And perhaps those questions would never have complete answers, because sometimes solving a murder identifies the perpetrator without making the crime understandable, and that is one of the most difficult realities of true crime. The public often expects a final explanation, a motive that makes the entire story fit neatly together. But real investigations do not always provide that kind of closure, and April's case was no different, because the most important mystery, the identity of her killer, had finally been solved. But the emotional mystery of why such a terrible crime happened could never be answered in a way that made sense. And as Miller entered the prison system, April's family was left to face a different kind of future, one without the uncertainty that had dominated their lives, but also one without the daughter they had lost. And that distinction matters, because closure is often used as though solving a cold case automatically ends the grief. Yet grief does not operate according to investigative timelines. A conviction can answer, but it cannot answer what April might have become, who she might have loved, what career she might have chosen, what kind of adult she might have been, or how many ordinary moments her family would have shared with her. And those lost possibilities remained untouched by the courtroom. But there was something the conviction could provide that the family had not possessed for 30 years. Accountability. And accountability mattered because it established that April's death would not remain an unresolved statistic in an old police file. Her case had been investigated, her evidence had been preserved, her killer had been identified, and the legal system had imposed a sentence. And that sequence became especially meaningful because of the way the suspect had finally been found through technology that did not exist in its modern form when April was murdered. And the case became a powerful demonstration of how rapidly forensic investigation had changed, because in 1988, investigators could recover biological evidence without being able to identify its source, while 3 decades later, investigators could analyze that same genetic information, search for relatives, reconstruct family connections, and eventually identify a suspect. And the implications were enormous, because April was not the only victim whose case contained unidentified DNA, and investigators across the country began considering whether old evidence could be revisited using similar techniques, turning evidence rooms into archives of possibilities rather than places where forgotten cases simply gathered dust. And for families of other cold case victims, April's story offered something that had been missing for years, the possibility that an old case could still move forward. But the case also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, because without the original biological material, the genetic genealogy breakthrough would never have happened. And without the later evidence connecting the same profile to the Fort Wayne incidents, investigators might have had a far more difficult path toward identifying the offender. And without the work of detectives and forensic specialists who continued pursuing the case, the technology might never have been applied to April's DNA in the first place, meaning the final breakthrough was not one miraculous moment, but the accumulation of decades of work, each investigator contributing another piece to a puzzle that eventually became complete. And perhaps that is why the case remains so powerful even after the conviction, because it showed that an investigation can outlive the people who originally worked it. Evidence can outlive the technology used to collect it, and a question can remain alive long after the world assumes it has been forgotten. And for April Tinsley, the question survived 30 years until science finally provided the answer. But behind every forensic breakthrough was the same reality. April had been 8 years old when her life ended, and nothing could change that. Nothing could return her to her family, and nothing could give her the decades she should have experienced. Yet the truth had finally emerged, and that truth now carried the weight of a guilty plea and an 80-year sentence, while the evidence that once sat silently inside a cold case file had become the force that brought the case back to life. And somewhere between the old crime scene, the preserved DNA, the genealogical records, and the courtroom, the distance between 1988 and 2018 finally disappeared, leaving behind one undeniable fact. The past had not forgotten April, and neither had the evidence. The most extraordinary thing about the April Tinsley investigation was not that investigators eventually found a suspect, but that the crucial evidence had been waiting for them since the beginning. Hidden in biological material collected after an 8-year-old girl was murdered in 1988. And for decades, that evidence could tell investigators only one thing with certainty. Somewhere in the genetic code was the identity of the man connected to April's death, but the technology available at the time could not turn that identity into a name. And so the evidence remained inside the case file while the investigation moved through years of frustration, changing detectives, changing priorities, and unanswered questions. And the passage of time seemed to work against the family. But in a strange way, time was also preserving the possibility of justice, because the DNA did not forget. It did not change its story, and it did not care that 30 years had passed. And when forensic science finally developed methods capable of searching beyond traditional criminal databases, investigators could return to that old evidence and ask an entirely different question, not whether the unknown DNA matched a person already known to police, but whether it could reveal the biological relatives of the person who left it behind. And that change in strategy opened a door that had remained locked for 3 decades, leading investigators eventually toward John D. Miller, a man who had never appeared in the original investigation as the obvious answer, but whose genetic connections placed him within the family line investigators were examining. And suddenly the case was no longer a story about an invisible offender. It was a story about a specific living man, and that was when the detectives had to move with extraordinary care, because they knew that a genealogical lead was not the same thing as proof, and if they were going to arrest Miller, they needed direct forensic evidence connecting him to the biological profile recovered during the investigation. So detectives watched him, studied his movements, and waited for an opportunity to obtain his DNA without alerting him, and eventually they collected discarded material from his trash, including used condoms, and submitted the material for analysis, and the laboratory result was the moment the investigation changed forever, because Miller's DNA matched the DNA profile associated with the evidence from April's murder and the later material recovered during the investigation. Transforming the genealogy led into a direct forensic connection, and suddenly the unknown man who had haunted the case since 1988 had a name, John Miller. But even then, investigators had to remember that a DNA match was evidence, not a complete explanation, and they needed to know what Miller would say when confronted with it, because the next step was the interview. And on July 15th, 2018, detectives approached Miller at his home in Grabille, Indiana, and asked him to come with them to the Fort Wayne Police Department. And according to the probable cause affidavit, once he was advised of his rights and questioned, Miller immediately identified the subject of the investigation by saying April Tinsley, a moment that must have carried an extraordinary weight for the investigators sitting across from him, because for 30 years, April's name had been attached to an unknown offender, and now the man sitting in front of them was saying her name before the full purpose of the interview had even been explained, and investigators confronted him with the DNA evidence. And according to authorities, Miller eventually admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by choking her. And he reportedly described taking her body to the location where it was later discovered, giving investigators information that could be compared with the evidence already known from the original investigation. And now the case contained a convergence that was almost impossible to ignore. The old biological evidence pointed toward the same genetic profile. Later evidence was consistent with that profile. Genealogy led investigators toward Miller's family. Direct DNA testing connected Miller to the profile, and according to authorities, Miller himself acknowledged responsibility, and that combination of evidence became the foundation of the prosecution. But for the people who had followed the case for years, another question remained. Why had it taken 30 years? And the answer was not one simple failure, because cold cases are rarely created by a single mistake. They are created by the collision of time, limited technology, incomplete information, changing investigative circumstances, and the simple fact that a suspect can remain invisible when investigators do not yet possess the tools to see him. And in April's case, the original investigators had biological evidence but lacked the technology needed to transform it into a person. And that limitation was enormous, because a DNA profile without a reference sample can establish a genetic identity without revealing a legal identity, meaning investigators could know that the same man had contributed biological material without knowing who that man was, and traditional databases could only help if the offender or another relevant individual was already represented within them, and Miller apparently was not, leaving detectives with a genetic profile but no name. And that problem remained for years until genetic genealogy offered another route, and the method itself was based on a deceptively simple principle. Every person inherits DNA from biological relatives, and those inherited segments can create identifiable relationships across generations, meaning that even if the offender himself has never submitted DNA, a distant relative might have, and that distant relative can become a signpost pointing toward the offender's family. And once enough signposts are identified, genealogists can begin reconstructing a family tree, eliminating branches, narrowing possibilities, and eventually identifying a small group of people who could plausibly be the source of the unknown DNA. And that is what happened in April's case, with investigators eventually narrowing their attention toward Miller and his brother. But the significance of the breakthrough extended far beyond one suspect, because it demonstrated that the concept of a cold case could change. A case could be dormant without being dead, and evidence could remain valuable even when conventional investigation had exhausted its options, and that realization became particularly important for families who had spent decades hearing that there were no new leads, because April's case showed that a new lead did not necessarily have to come from a person, a confession, or a forgotten witness. Sometimes it could come from technology that had not existed when the crime occurred, and the case therefore became a symbol of patience. Not simply the patience of investigators, but the patience of evidence itself, because the biological material collected after April's death remained preserved through the years, waiting for a future in which scientists could extract more information from it than investigators in 1988 could have imagined. And that is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story, because while April's family experienced every passing year as another reminder of loss, the evidence experienced time differently, sitting silently inside storage, carrying the same genetic information decade after decade, and eventually that information became the key to the case. But even after Miller was identified, investigators had to confront another part of the investigation that had haunted them for years: the strange messages, biological material that appeared long after April's murder, because those incidents suggested that the offender had not simply disappeared after 1988, and the DNA connection between the later evidence and April's case gave investigators another reason to believe they were following the same man. And those later incidents made the case even more disturbing because they demonstrated that the biological trail had continued beyond the original crime, creating a link between evidence separated by years. And while the exact motivations behind the messages could only be understood through the offender's own mind, investigators now had something they had never possessed before: a genetic identity that could connect evidence across time. And that genetic consistency was critical because it allowed investigators to look at the case as a continuous investigation, rather than a collection of unrelated events. And once Miller was identified, the old evidence could be reevaluated with a new level of clarity, and every piece of information had to be tested against the same question. It supported the conclusion that Miller was the man behind the DNA profile, and the answer kept pointing in the same direction, and that convergence ultimately made it possible for prosecutors to move forward without relying on one fragile piece of evidence. And as the legal process advanced, Miller faced serious charges connected to April's death, and the possibility of a full trial remained. But the case eventually moved toward a negotiated resolution, and in December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty and received an 80-year prison sentence, bringing the legal uncertainty to an end. But the conviction did not erase the mystery surrounding the years between 1988 and 2018, because investigators and the public could not help but wonder how Miller had lived for so long without being identified, whether he had ever believed the investigation would catch him, and whether he understood how close the evidence had always been to exposing him. And perhaps the most unsettling answer was that the evidence had been closer than anyone realized, because the DNA profile had effectively carried his identity from the beginning, but investigators lacked the means to read it. And when the technology finally arrived, the decades collapsed almost instantly, transforming a cold case into an active investigation and then into an arrest. And that transformation changed the way many people thought about unsolved crimes, because a case that had seemed frozen could suddenly move with extraordinary speed once the right piece of technology appeared, and April's name became part of that transformation, not because her story was merely a scientific experiment, but because the evidence collected after her death proved that a victim can continue to speak through forensic science long after she is gone. And April could not tell investigators what happened to her, could not identify her attacker, and could not explain where she had been taken. But the biological evidence preserved from the investigation could provide a clue that eventually led detectives to the person accused of killing her. And that is why the DNA breakthrough was so powerful. It did not create the truth. It revealed a truth that had been present all along, and after 30 years, the anonymous profile finally became a name. The name became a suspect. The suspect became a defendant, and the defendant eventually became a convicted murderer serving an 80-year sentence, while April remained forever 8 years old in the photographs that survived her. And the case left behind a lesson that investigators would carry into other cold cases. Never assume that an old piece of evidence has lost its value simply because it has been silent for years, because sometimes the evidence is not waiting to be discovered. It is waiting for science to become capable of understanding what it has been saying all along. The moment John D. Miller reportedly said the words, April Tinsley, the atmosphere surrounding one of Indiana's most haunting cold cases changed forever, because for 30 years, investigators had been searching for an unknown man, a biological profile without a name, a killer who existed in the evidence but not in the identity records. And now that anonymous figure was sitting across from detectives in an interrogation room, listening as they told him that science had finally connected him to the DNA recovered from a crime committed 3 decades earlier. And according to the probable cause affidavit, Miller knew immediately what they were talking about, and that response became one of the most chilling moments in the investigation because it suggested that April's name had remained somewhere inside his memory for all those years, even while her family had been waiting for an answer and investigators had not. Arrived at that room by chance, they had followed a forensic trail that began in 1988, continued through later evidence in 2004, passed through genetic genealogy, and finally led directly to Miller through a DNA comparison obtained from discarded material, and that sequence was critical because the interrogation came after the forensic identification, not before it, meaning investigators already had substantial evidence before they asked Miller to explain himself, and according to authorities, once detectives confronted him with the DNA evidence, Miller eventually admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by choking her, then described taking her body to the location where it was later found, and those admissions transformed the investigation yet again because now detectives could compare Miller's statements with facts known from the original case, and every detail that matched. The physical evidence strengthened the prosecution's position, while any discrepancy could have created another investigative question, but the overall case was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence because the DNA evidence connected Miller to the biological profile, the genetic genealogy. Investigation had independently pointed investigators toward his family, and his own statements placed him in the events surrounding April's death, creating a convergence of forensic and testimonial evidence that had not existed at any earlier stage of the investigation. And yet, even at that moment, investigators knew they had to proceed carefully because a confession is not automatically the end of a criminal case, especially when the crime is decades old, and prosecutors must still establish that the statement was legally obtained and that the surrounding evidence supports it. But the case against Miller was already built on more than his words, and that became one of its greatest strengths because the evidence had been developing long before he entered the interrogation room. And as investigators reconstructed April's final day, they returned to the original facts of the case: the 8-year-old girl who had disappeared while traveling toward a friend's home, the frantic search that followed, and the discovery of her body 3 days later in a rural area of DeKalb County. And the discovery had transformed a missing child investigation into a homicide investigation almost immediately because detectives were now dealing with a crime that had devastated the community and demanded answers. But those answers did not come quickly, and the investigation gradually became one of those cases in which every promising lead seemed to disappear, and the biological evidence became the one constant, the silent thread that remained even as people changed and memories faded. And when later messages and biological evidence appeared in 2004, investigators realized that the same unknown male profile could be connected to material appearing years after the original murder. But again, they had no name, and that was the fundamental problem. The DNA could identify a biological source, but not a person unless there was something to compare it with. And that problem remained until genetic genealogy provided an entirely new investigative pathway, allowing detectives to examine the unknown DNA through the lens of family relationships. And when Parabon nanolabs and genetic genealogists ceased, more became involved. The investigation moved into territory that traditional police work could not reach because the DNA did not need to match Miller directly in an existing law enforcement database. Instead, investigators could follow genetic connections to relatives and reconstruct a family network, eventually narrowing the possibilities to 2 brothers in the Fort Wayne area, one of whom was Miller, and at that point detectives had something they had never possessed before: a realistic suspect. But they still needed direct confirmation, and that was why surveillance and discarded DNA collection became so important, because investigators could not simply announce that genealogy had identified the killer. They had to prove the biological connection directly, and the discarded material gave them the opportunity to do exactly that, with laboratory testing confirming that Miller's DNA matched the profile connected to April's murder and the later evidence. And after receiving that result, investigators moved quickly, approaching Miller at his residence and bringing him to the police department, where the interview began. And the moment he identified April's name showed that the investigation had reached a different level because the detectives were no longer asking questions about an unknown offender in the abstract. They were asking a named man about a named victim. And according to the affidavit, Miller's eventual admissions included details that investigators could compare with the physical evidence, including his account of where April's body had been taken and left. And the more the investigators compared his statements with the established facts, the more the pieces appeared to fit, and the case moved rapidly from investigation to prosecution. But for April's family, the speed of the final months was almost surreal because they had spent 30 years waiting for something that had suddenly happened in a matter of weeks. A suspect identified, DNA confirmed, an arrest made, and an alleged confession obtained. And that contrast between 30 years of silence and a few weeks of rapid developments was emotionally overwhelming because the family had been forced to learn patience in the most painful way possible, and now they had to process information faster than they had ever expected, including details they had waited decades to hear, but perhaps never truly wanted to hear, because knowing what happened to April meant confronting the reality of her final moments. And that is one of the cruel contradictions of solving a cold case. The truth can be what a family has desperately wanted and simultaneously what they most fear, because an unanswered question can preserve uncertainty, but an answer can make the loss painfully concrete. And April's family had lived with that uncertainty since 1988. While Miller had apparently continued his life without being publicly identified as the person connected to the crime, and the fact that he had remained in the region added another disturbing dimension because the man investigators believed responsible had not vanished into another country or disappeared completely from society. He had remained within the broader community, living a life that appeared ordinary while the murder remained unsolved, and that reality demonstrated one of the most unsettling truths about cold cases. Suspects do not always look like suspects, and without forensic evidence connecting them to a crime, there may be nothing visible that distinguishes them from anyone else, which is why the DNA became so important, because it provided an objective connection that did not depend on appearance, reputation, or rumor. And when that connection was established, the old assumptions surrounding the case could be reconsidered through a new lens, and investigators could finally ask questions about Miller's life in 1988, his movements, his proximity to April's route, and the circumstances surrounding the places he described. But the most powerful evidence remained biological because DNA had been present since the beginning, and now it was pointing toward the same man identified through genealogy, and that convergence made the case extraordinarily difficult to ignore. But even with the confession, prosecutors still had to decide how to proceed because a trial would expose the family to months or years of legal proceedings, potentially requiring them to hear graphic testimony and relive the investigation in public, while a guilty plea could bring certainty more quickly and ensure a lengthy sentence without the risks associated with trial. And eventually, Miller agreed to a plea resolution, and in December 2018, he pleaded guilty, ending the possibility that the case would remain unresolved in court, and the judge sentenced him to 80 years in prison, a sentence that effectively guaranteed he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. And for the Tinsley family, that judgment marked a major turning point because the legal system had finally established responsibility, but it did not erase the years before it, and it could not erase the image of April as an 8-year-old girl, a child who should have had decades ahead of her, and the family had to reconcile two realities at once. Justice had finally arrived, and yet it had arrived 30 years too late to save her, and perhaps that is why the phrase cold case solved can sound misleading, because the case may be solved, but the pain created by the crime remains alive, and the people who love the victim still have to carry the consequences. And April's story continued to resonate because her case demonstrated both the limits and the possibilities of modern investigation. The limits because no technology could undo the murder, and the possibilities because technology could identify the person responsible long after conventional investigation had reached a dead end. end, and the genetic genealogy breakthrough became part of a larger transformation in forensic science, encouraging investigators to revisit old cases with unidentified DNA and consider whether distant genetic relatives could provide the missing link. But the April Tinsley investigation also demonstrated why evidence preservation matters, because if the original biological material had been lost, contaminated, or destroyed, the genetic genealogy breakthrough might never have occurred, and that means every investigator who preserved the evidence decades earlier became part of the eventual solution, even though they could not possibly have known how important their work would become. And that is, perhaps, the most remarkable part of the story. The people who collected the evidence in 1988 were working with the technology of their own time, yet their careful work created the foundation for scientists and detectives 30 years later, and the case became a bridge across generations of investigators, with each generation adding another layer: the original crime scene work, the DNA analysis, the later investigation into messages and biological evidence, the genealogy research, the surveillance operation, the direct DNA comparison, the interrogation, and finally, the guilty plea and sentence. And when those pieces were assembled, the mystery that had seemed impossible finally had an answer. John Miller was identified as the man responsible for April's murder, and he was sentenced to 80 years in prison. But the case left behind a haunting question that no courtroom could answer: how many other victims were still waiting for science to catch up? How many unidentified DNA profiles were sitting in evidence rooms around the country? And how many families were still looking at old photographs of children who never had the chance to grow up, hoping that somewhere inside an old case file was the clue that would eventually reveal the truth? And April's case offered those families a reason to keep hoping, because 30 years had not destroyed the evidence and time had not protected the killer forever. The DNA had waited, the investigators had persisted, and eventually the technology arrived. And when it did, the past came rushing into the present with enough force to expose the man who had spent decades believing the mystery would remain unsolved. For 3 decades, the murder of April Tinsley existed in the public imagination as a question without an answer, a photograph without a conclusion, a case file that contained evidence but no identity. And when John Miller was finally arrested in July 2018, the transformation was almost impossible to comprehend, because the mystery that had survived for an entire generation suddenly had a name, a face, an address, and a man sitting in a police interrogation room being asked to explain what investigators believed he had done. But for April's family, the arrest did not feel like the end of the story, because the word solved could never describe what had happened to them. It could only describe the investigation, and those were two very different things, because the investigation could be solved while the grief remained. The evidence could be explained while the loss remained permanent, and the courtroom could deliver a sentence while the years that April should have lived remained forever missing, and that tension followed the case into every stage of its final chapter, beginning with the evidence that had brought Miller into focus. Because investigators had not simply guessed his identity, they had followed a chain. That began with DNA recovered after April's murder, moved through later biological evidence, and eventually entered the world of genetic genealogy, where distant biological relationships helped point detectives toward Miller's family, and that genealogical lead was then independently tested through DNA obtained from material discarded by Miller, producing the direct match investigators needed. And the significance of that process was extraordinary, because it meant that the evidence collected after April's death had remained relevant for 30 years, surviving not only the passage of time, but also the limitations of the technology available when the crime occurred. And once Miller became a suspect, detectives had to determine